Welcome to our Conversations with Contemplatives. Today we have a very special guest, Nicholas or Nick Schmidt, who did retreats starting in 2018 up until about a year ago, self-supporting for the first year and then supported by Tsadra Foundation scholarship. Nick is going to be very interesting for a couple of reasons. One, his path really has represented what Tsadra Foundation considers the ideal of combining study and practice, and we'll go into that in some detail with him. And also, he's the first of our conversations with an individual who did retreat in solitary retreat, which is quite a different animal from the group 3-year retreat. So hopefully we can explore some of that. So Nick, welcome. Nice to have you on this auspicious day of the Chukar.
Yes, thank you. Happy Chukar to you.
So in these conversations, I like to go back and trace the roots. So if you can just describe a little bit how Buddhism came into your life, how did it turn out, what drew you to Buddhism in particular, and later the idea of retreat, what inspired you about the idea of retreat?
So I grew up in a very religiously liberal household. I was raised Unitarian Universalist. So in my community growing up, I knew Buddhists, just like I knew Christians and Jewish people, and it was very pluralistic, my community. So it wasn't some kind of foreign thing, as long as I've been conscious of what religion is. But when I was a teenager, I started to get interested in non-American ideals. And after kind of turning to Asia and Asian traditions, Buddhism kind of won out in this kind of horse race, and just kept being more and more interested, finding more and more truths there, and everything else just kind of fell away. So I went to college at 17, and by that time I had my own little bedroom solitary practice. This was very inspired by Jack Kerouac and the whole beat tradition of Zen Buddhist interest. And the college I went to, which is now called Cal Poly Humboldt, had a experiential weekend course where you would go with a religious studies teacher. You would go to religious communities in the area and be exposed to their traditions for a weekend. So I did some in evangelical Christianity and Sufism, and found my way to a practice community called Ling, which was about a 90-minute drive away from the college where I went. And I had been practicing at that point with the Arcata Zen group, and I did a session at the San Francisco Zen Center. So I had a pretty established, as much as a 17-year-old freshman in college can have it to be as a practice in Zen. And the first time I went there, they had members of the Sangha speak to us about their own kind of lived experiences in Buddhism and in that community, and what led them to be where they were, which is where we met them. And I didn't really like it very much at all. I was kind of turned off and by all the complexity and the general eccentricities of the place. And I continued practicing Zen for another maybe a year more after that, and had an experience of kind of wanting more from my Zen practice. Specifically, there were devotional elements of for Kanzeon or Chenuzig in Sunio Suzuki's practice communities, where you would pray to Kanzeon and do prostrations. And I had a moment of kind of clicking where I was like, oh, this is great. You know, this should be more emphasized in my, life. And so then I kind of remembered my experiences at Riggs and Ling, and the next year I signed up for the same class. and went back. And this time we did a Rio Songtree practice pre-dawn outside, a big smoke offering practice. And I really fell in love with that connection between people and other more than human beings and the environment made a very big impact on me. And I kind of, I was sold.
Well,
And
that recently is a Tibetan center.
it is, yeah, it's Enigma primarily, the primarily Enigma Center.
Yeah.
In Trinity County in California.
Okay.
So that was kind of it for me. I heard at that time about the person who is to become my teacher and my retreat guide. And at the time, he was in his own 3+ years retreat on the hill above Riggs and Ling. So I didn't get to meet him. Then the second time I went was in 2006, and I didn't finally meet him until the end of 2009. But his being in retreat was a major influence on me. And I would say his primary activity as a Lama has been to guide people, prepare people, guide people, and help integrate people back into life after a long retreat. So it was kind of destiny.
So during this time, you were still continuing your academic studies.
Yeah, pursuing undergraduate. I eventually got a BA in religious studies and cultural geography, which led me to Tibet. And yeah.
And then you went on to Nepal to do a master's?
Eventually, yes. It took about 3 years after I graduated with the BA to kind of discern that the program at Rangjung Institute in Nepal was what I wanted to do, and had my own kind of journey as a aspiring translator that was in tandem with my journey as an aspiring retreatant. But so they led me to Kathmandu initially in 2012 for my first language study program. And then I moved there in the fall of 2014.
Okay, so yeah, so you had a fair amount of study. Was there a reason why you decided you wanted to do more study before you got into deeper practice?
I think that I knew that a life of, if not scholarly study, then translation lended itself really well to a life of retreat and practice. And it wasn't really like a conscious, overarching motivation for me. It just kind of made sense. And there wasn't really anything else that I wanted to do.
Right. I think for a lot of individuals like yourself coming from the practice side, often the language, kind of wanting to be able to master the language is a reason a lot of people do pursue studies from that side.
Yeah, and it's very interesting because my Lama is American and he knows a few vocabulary words of Tibetan, but his teacher, Tsadra Rinpoche, taught him exclusively in English. And so my teacher only teaches in English, and it's an English medium transmission line. So that, it wasn't my teacher or the practice community saying, in order to do a retreat, you have to learn the liturgical languages. It was just my own kind of personal compulsion or drive.
Yeah. So then you came back and you decided to go into a long retreat yourself.
Yeah, I finished my MA, and in the fall of 2018, I moved back to California, and I spent the summer of 2018 finishing my master's thesis, and I defended on a Friday in September. And the following Wednesday, I had my first interview with my Lama for the first time in maybe 2 years. I hadn't seen him. So I go to his house, which is a few counties over in California, and he meets me at his doorstep, and the first thing he says to me is, "Your 3-year retreat cabin is ready for you." And I said, "Okay." And there were some kind of premonitions or not premonitions, but preparations that I was kind of making ahead of time, not really consciously headed towards a long retreat, but um, using this gap of time after the completion of the master's degree before I was planning on going to PhD programs. And he's just said it so casually and matter of factly. All I could say was, okay. And so I had kind of arrangements to stay in a cabin that was not the cabin that he was talking about in Oregon at a Chadra Kompa center called Rigzen, which is near Williams, Oregon. And I planned to just stay there through the fall and figure out what I was going to do next or where I was going to apply, kind of push off having to return to the workforce.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was suggested to begin the 3-year retreat on a Wednesday. And then I believe the following Tuesday after that, I was driving with my retreat things to Oregon, to Rigzen, and that's how it began.
Just kind of naturally slid right in.
Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of questions about funding and how I was going to make it happen, but I was going to a retreat place anyway, and decided to just figure it out as I went along.
Right. So then, so describe a little bit your retreat situation. You had a cabin, you were on your own.
So just to begin with, for the first 3 months, I was in a cabin. I think there might have been 2 other people on a much more developed retreat property there in Williams. And at the beginning of the next new year in January, then I moved to my Lama's retreat land, which is adjacent to Rigzen in Trinity County. And the basic scene of that property was that it was up the hill from Rigzen, and it was on about 47 acres of complete hilly properties. And at the time when I began, there were 2 retreat cabins and then my Lama's house. And in my Lama's house, there lived a caretaker. And in the other retreat cabin, there was a retreatant who had been there for 2 years or so, who was in her own private, personal, or solitary retreat. And so the cabin that I ended up living in first was further away from those 2, kind of across a ravine in the woods.
And so describe a little bit how your day was structured, how things worked for you in retreat. Because obviously, a group 3-year retreat is very structured and it has its challenges, and but solitary retreat has some advantages and some challenges of its own. So talk a little bit about first of all how your practice schedule was structured.
Well, I will start by saying that it changed it a lot throughout the seasons and throughout the beginning of, from the beginning to the end, to the middle. It was all very responsive to the needs of myself and the seasons, because the retreat was essentially there was a caretaker, but besides that, it was unsupported. So, having to bring in, acquire and bring in groceries and fuel and everything I needed to live in a small cabin in the middle of the woods. And one thing about that place where I was retreating is that the temperature swings are incredibly dramatic. So the practice schedule was really kind of second for most of the time to my living needs. And I think there were maybe, of the 4.5 plus years that I was in retreat on that land, there was only maybe a few months with like a very extremely set schedule.
Okay.
Those are times of intensive, usually deity yoga practices. So don't know if how long the answer should be if I want to go into the full breadth of the practices, but I will say that I was amazed and continue to be amazed throughout the whole time how different every day and week was. And as you mentioned, the challenges of that is it really kind of helped to break down my ideas of what was retreat and what is not retreat, and what is meditation and non-meditation, and all those things.
So I mean, you do a number of practice sessions each day, I assume, depending on chores and chopping wood and carrying water.
Yeah. Yeah, it could be, sometimes it was one practice session, sometimes four. I mostly settled on three practice sessions,
Right.
Doing labor or tasks in the morning or some kind of yoga practice, and then doing more seated formal practice throughout the day and then into the night. But I kind of try to stay away from what my teacher calls TikTok time, and to not the app, but like clock time.
Yeah.
It took on a different meaning over the time I was in retreat, but so just going by how much light I had, or how much daylight I had, or how much time I had before conditions became impossible to work in or walk in, and all of that.
So reflecting on life in solitary retreat, what would you say is kind of the most inspiring aspect of solitary retreat, and what do you think would say is the most challenging or the most difficult challenges of being in solitary retreat?
I think the inspiring part is two things come to mind. The first is how, as my Lama said to somebody else, we're never really alone. There's always other beings around. Traditionally we talk about beings filling space, and even if you kind of set aside that cosmological view of there being identities that span the entire knowable universe or whatever, then there's always beings around. Or if you want to personify elemental forces or beings that inhabit places, which I personally truly believe in. And so setting out on a solitary retreat, if you have the senses to listen and become attuned to who's out there, then it becomes very much less solitary. But on the other hand, I'm a social person by nature, and kind of oscillate between being an introvert and extroverted. And for a lot of my retreat, I was feeling very extroverted, but kind of making the motions of a austerity of solitude, which was very difficult. However, it was, it's incomparable in terms of the level of silence you can attain in your mind stream when you don't have to show up to anybody or for anybody, and you can just kind of be present with everyone who's around you.
Often we talk about retreat, is the idea is we take the universe into retreat with us, with our intention. Right? So basically we're not excluding the world or escaping from the world, but our intention is taking the world into retreat with us.
Yeah, there's a sense of also of purpose for other Buddhists, and kind of bringing forward this very old tradition into completely contradicting times that are working in every single way and avenue against solitude and practice, which is kind of this. There's a little bit of like a nobility in that, and strength. And if you feel that the purpose of your retreat is for other beings, then there's so much resource in it, and you can kind of push yourself in ways that you wouldn't otherwise. A lot of times I just found myself relying on the existence of my community out there for support.
So it sounds like what you're saying is the solitude of a solitary retreat is both what was inspiring and challenging.
Yeah.
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 So what tradition were you practicing in retreat?
The kind of four main practices that I engaged in, four cycles of practice, were all Terma traditions from the Nyingma school. And three of them were revealed by members of the Kensei incarnation lineage.
Okay.
And the fourth one was revealed by Dujun Lingpa, his Dujun Truma cycle. So it's primarily those, and then based on previous commitments that I received, empowerments and transmissions that I received over the course of my Buddhist life before retreat, I would incorporate other things like, more eclectic and ecumenical protector prayers, things like that.
So you also, I think, had some challenges with the elements, your retreat center.
Yeah, I my cabin burned down while I was away from it, and there's kind of a larger story, but to kind of put that in context of my own life, I was living in Nepal at the time of the 2015 earthquake and was affected by it, and stayed in country for about a week before I could leave the country after the earthquake struck. So a lot of my healing work that I brought for myself into retreat was kind of recovering from the traumatic stress of that incident and in the hard winter that followed that in Nepal. And I really felt still rattled when I entered retreat in 2018. And a lot of my reflection, psychological work, writing, and processing was about that incident and kind of I don't know, survivor's guilt is part of it, but it was a very momentous karmic event, this earthquake. And so just when that was kind of settling out and I felt my nervous system's settling down and calming down, I received the news that my mother had stage 4 pancreatic cancer and decided to end my retreat. This was in late June of 2021. And I kind of made the decision. I mean, it wasn't really, there wasn't a decision to make. My mother was essentially terminally ill without that exact diagnosis yet. But I knew someone who had passed away from pancreatic cancer in Nepal, and I knew exactly what to expect. So essentially, as soon as that phone call ended, I began to pack my bags to leave and took what I needed to continue my retreat and practice materials, all of the accoutrement of Vajrayana practice, and eventually moved back to my childhood bedroom in my parents' house, which was that whole event, those 2 weeks were extremely chaotic and tumultuous for myself. And to put it kind of linearly, I left my retreat cabin on a Sunday, and the Tuesday following that, I went to the first oncology meeting with my mother and father. And 2 weeks after that, after they were continuing scans and tests and waiting for results, things like that, a fire that had begun very soon after I left that land, there was a lightning strike, started a fire. The fire was creeping up the Trinity River Valley. We kind of watched it slowly burn upriver. And on the very day that my mom got the news that her cancer was incurable, the local emergency services sent out an evacuation uh, order for the area that I had been living in. And eventually it did burn, and all 47 acres of that land were touched by fire, and including my first retreat cabin. So that was a summer of intense suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a lot of questions about what to do next and what I was doing at the time. And kind of throughout it, from my mom's diagnosis until after the fire, until I went back to the cabin or went back to the land, my Lama was consistently saying, stay in retreat, keep the mindset, keep your practice commitments, just keep going, basically. It was just kind of a motto for our tradition. But he had certainty about it. I had anything but certainty about it. And just spent the next 7 months trying to integrate practice with caring for my mother and family and being a family member, but also a retreatant in the house, and a very non-traditional way of retreating. So I did return to the cabin after it had burned, but before I moved back to retreat, and it was just the proverbial steaming, smoking pile of rubble. And the whole entire forest around it was charred to mineral soil. And, without a real true estimate, I would guess maybe 95% of the trees on that property were either completely consumed by fire or damaged in such a way that they would imminently die and are imminently dying. So I had been preparing for fire the entire time. It's a reality of living in the woods in California at this point. And so I wasn't exactly surprised that it happened, but it did happen. And provided a very visceral lesson in impermanence, because I had been building up this identity as a retreatant or somebody who was aspiring to become a retreatant or like acquiring the skills of a retreatant.
Mm-hmm.
And, since 2006. So for well over a decade, maybe, I don't know, 15, 16 years up to that time. And including the first 2.5 years of my retreat, I was that person, in my core. And then I lost it all. I had to leave retreat out of a family need, an emergency. And
Mm-hmm.
then I lost the palace of my dreams, the retreat palace of my dreams, which was, pretty perfect in every way you can imagine when I took residence in it. And I think I saw a video on social media of my very cabin burning, and I haven't found it again, and I didn't really save it at the time, but I'm quite certain that I saw a video of the hillside burning, and there was one spot that was particularly viciously burning, as one would if it was burning, all these kinds of propellants that I keep in my house. So I just watched. I was able to watch it go up in flames and deal with the aftermath of that within the forest that I came to love so much.
Mm.
So all told, I was out of the cabin for 7 months in the meantime.
But eventually you made your way back to the retreat land?
Yes, by the time the fire happened, I was the only person in long-term retreat on the land. And the second cabin in question, the cabin that I moved into, was closer to the road. So there were some kind of state and maybe even national firefighters who were able to defend that cabin with hose lines. And the fire had creeped up on the ground cover to within maybe 18 inches of the base of that cabin, but it was still standing. And kind of as soon as the dust settled, a few days or weeks after the fire, my Lama said, you can just keep going in that other cabin. There's not really anybody on deck for this. So whenever you want to return, you feel free to return. So at the end of my 7 months as a cancer caregiver and son person, I returned to retreat.
So your
in
mom
this other
passed away at
cabin.
that point? Your mom
Yeah,
passed away.
she passed away in January of 2022, and then I stayed there for about a month, primarily practicing in the room where she passed away, in my family house, and then I returned to retreat.
Wow, quite an extraordinary story.
Yeah.
So then when you finally completed your retreat and left retreat, talk a little bit about kind of that decision and how it was coming out of retreat.
Well, the retreat, as I mentioned before, this kind of idea of retreat had been broken down.
Yeah.
It just was left in, just completely destroyed, there's no trace of it left to even try to rebuild. And all of those ideas about being solitary or being this kind of, a retreatant, like with capital R, were just gone. But all I really knew how to do and wanted to do was practice the Dharma in some way.
Yeah.
So that led me back, but it was predictably not the same at all. So I had the best practice of leaving retreat, which is actually leaving retreat. And when it came time to actually leave retreat, I think that made the whole thing a lot easier. And a lot of the obstacles that I would have had about how to listen to myself, or my inability to listen to myself, that I went into retreat with, had been done away with. And so I was at that point trained in discerning what I needed.
Right.
And it was a personal decision. I instigated the end of my retreat and brought it to my Lama, and he said, no, you need to stay at least one more year. So that's why it was so prolonged. I stayed in retreat a year and a half after I left, after I returned. And after that year had been up and I kind of did as he said, then I guess some kind of backstory is that I suffered a lot in that smaller second cabin, on kind of every level. I think it's probably predictable after the loss of a very important parent and all of that life upheaval. But in addition to all of those inner upheavals, there was the outer upheaval of having to kind of disinflate my lifestyle, so to speak, because my first cabin was about 2 or maybe 3 times the size of my second cabin.
Yeah.
And it was much more materially comfortable. It was made kind of in a modern design way and had very good insulation, and it was like kind of just a beautiful, inspiring building, quad building, And the other cabin, it had been blown apart by blessings. Basically, there had been decades of practitioners practicing, doing all kinds of jumps and shakes and flops, and just living life in that cabin for, I don't know, something like 20, 25, maybe 30 years at that point. And uh, you could see daylight from the inside in many places. They were just kind of like holes, gaps where the wood had shrunk away, or the insulation had been eaten away by various kinds of critters. So it was cold and drafty and hot and tiny. And, um, having temperature inefficiency led to a lot of obstacles in through the whole, or not necessarily obstacles, but just difficulties. So, in terms of like the physical plane of living life in that cabin, I was all too ready to leave.
Yeah.
But it was difficult and to separate from that forest. And one of the blessings of being in a burned forest is you get to see how it was kind of at its maximal state of like intense brushy undergrowth and established trees and fauna that have been there since the last major fire, which came in 2008. So you got to see what will pass going forward as a mature forest in California, reduced to ash, and um, and then to watch it regrow over the next 3 years.
Yeah.
So it was difficult to be removed from that and to kind of turn off that channel and separate from the landscape.
I mean, it's interesting. There's such a degree of kind of encouragement for the inner work that one can do in retreat in Vajrayana traditions. At the same time, Vajrayana is in the sense of training to step into and embrace every situation in life as practice. Right. So there's some kind of contradiction there somehow. Just finding the point at which you decide to make that step out and take your practice into active life.
Mm-hmm.
So you seem to have landed on your feet. You're not in Oregon anymore.
I did, yeah. I, part of my internal knowing of when the retreat should end is, kind of had to do with my body, and I had this sense that if I continued, then the annoyances and difficulties and challenges in my physical body would could develop more if I had to live through another fire season or smoke season or winter. I don't, it would have been much harder. So I came out because um, on that level, uh, I could not push my luck. I pushed my luck right up until I made an educated guess about when my luck would start to run out, and um, that put me in a good position to move into my next phase of life because I uh, wasn't a broken person inside and out at that time. And I had been in a relationship through this retreat process and wanted to make that long distance relationship into a close distance relationship. So, long story short, I moved all the way across country to Virginia and kind of happened into a research job at the University of Virginia Tibet Center. So quickly, I wasn't planning on that kind of employment, and kind of had to rearrange some things in my life. And I had to kind of move twice. One was just basically a provisional move with just what I could carry on the plane, and then I had to drive back later and move the rest of my belongings here. But I think that particularly where I am now in Charlottesville is the perfect antidote to where I was in California, in Trinity County. So I'm finding the environment alone very, very healing. And it's very healing to be in a domestic relationship that is a great source of joy and happiness and inspiration. And so it's kind of enabled me to pull myself together as in a way that if I stayed in California and or had gone any other route, I don't think it would have been as harmonious circumstances.
Interesting. I mean, just reflecting, I often meet young people who kind of hear about it and decide they want to go off into retreat at a very young age without having created any like basis for surviving in the world. You were able to get your bachelor's and your master's degree, so you had some basis that you could kind of rely on coming out. And the interesting thread of connection was your interest in translation at the beginning through your studies, and now you're back engaged in translation work. So it's interesting threads of connection. So the other thing I'd like to just get your thoughts on, having kind of gone through your studies and then your practice, it's often kind of one of the issues we all face, those of us engaged in Vajrayana in the West, is to what extent things need to be or should be adapted. Now, your situation obviously demanded a lot of adaptation because the day-to-day situation required it. And if I understand, your teacher also was someone who made the choice to kind of adapt to a certain amount of things in his way of style of teaching. And so what are your thoughts in terms of the importance of tradition and the importance of adapting and how to kind of hold all of that, if you have any thoughts?
I'll start by just kind of giving background about that process because I didn't really mention it in the beginning. But when we first started dreaming up this retreat together, my Lama was insistent that I kind of stay connected in some way. Previous retreatants that had been guided by him were truly and utterly alone, not anywhere near other Sangha members or in any kind of community, so to speak of. So to live with two other people kind of in this community where we met for group practice occasionally, sometimes rarely, sometimes frequently. And to stay integrated was kind of a conscious thread the entire retreat. So I had to go out and buy my own food, except in a few rare cases where somebody did shopping for me. And I offered work besides just the basic chopping wood for myself. I offered labor around the property to kind of upkeep the hermitage. Everything from trail work to painting to other gardening, those kind of things. So pretty regularly, like once a week, I would give a half day or a full day to working like service projects, basically. And in the beginning, I really hated it. I really hated having to go into town and buy my own food and interrupt my process and my practice and everything. And watching my own journey with that, and how at first I hated going to town, and then I liked it, and then I was ambivalent, and then moving through it. And it was a major part of my retreat was watching this tiny town of Weaverville and my reaction to that town and who I became when I was in town. Watching that happen over the span of four and change years, kind of it provides a mirror, and it can be a very harsh mirror, and it can also provide a unmatched meditation on suffering and impermanence. And a lot of times I would come back from town more destroyed than from a week of practice, and have more renunciation just by seeing other people trapped in cycles of harm and like egotistical benefit seeking, seeking only to benefit themselves. And also the realities of living in a dying town.
Mm.
It used to be a lumber town, and now there's not really an identifiable um, economic driver of the town, even with there are some cash crops grown like in many places in California in the area, and that market has um, been decimated. So both above board and black market economies just absolutely tanked while I was there,
Okay.
and just watched storefronts close and new ones open and close, sometimes several times in the span of my retreat there. And we just come back and cry about the state of the world. It's just so depressing to be there. Um, so I think that if I had stayed in my initial cabin where I began in this box, and
Yeah.
I also had to buy my own food there, but if you stay in very confined spaces, you you become extremely proficient in Vajrayana, and you may become proficient in um, kind of identifying your own cycles and of kind of attached behavior. But it's not really a guaranteed. And I wouldn't say that like a kind of more balanced or integrated retreat guarantees that, but it provides a lot of opportunities that a traditional retreat can't do. And I think that we need both. I think that to speak grandly about Buddhism in America, um, we we can't. It won't survive if all we have are 3 year closed cell retreats, and it won't survive if all we have is um, integrated lay retreats that are, one toe in the world, the rest of the 9 toes in solitude or whatever. Um, and I think personally, it's too soon to say no to almost anything,
Mm.
because we're in this great process of transmission of the Dharma to the West. And um, as I say to anybody who will listen, the American Buddhist project, or the Euro-American Buddhist project, is only, I don't know, like not even 100 years old. If you go back to the time of like Alexander David Neal or any of the kind of British explorers who like went there. So in Buddhist history and temporal epochs of Buddhist history, we're still completely elidable. We could be lost to history if the project fails. And so I personally thought about, and when I thought about myself in retreat, I thought myself in a 3 year retreat, a very traditional,
Mm.
jump and control style retreat. And I know countless people who have done that kind of retreat, and I also know countless people who have done long solitary retreats. Um, and it's best when we all get together and
Yeah.
practice.
That's interesting. I mean, I think there's definitely something to be said for both styles, and it's really exciting and interesting. I mean, your story kind of has so many challenges, and it's a very colorful story. It's not, oh, I went off into a cabin and stayed there for 3.5 years or whatever. Um,
Yeah, in a lot of ways, I wish it had, but it was my karmic unfolding.
so, I mean, it's a great story, Nick. So thank you so much for sharing. I'm sure a lot of people will be
Thank
very
you.
inspired by your story, and I'll be interested to see how your life unfolds going forward.
Thank you. Nice to talk to you.
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing.